We received a letter from the woman who lived in my apartment 70 years ago, and she'd like to visit. I am not op. Original post by U.M.R. Benj Rocks in R. Mildly interesting. Trigger warnings. None. Less than. Mood spoilers. Pleasant. Less than. / We received a letter from the woman who lived in my apartment 70 years ago, and she'd like to visit. 03.03.23. Text of letter. Hi. I used to live in your flat 70 years ago before I came to England with my parents. My husband and I are coming to Sydney in March for a couple of days, arriving on the 15th, and I am wondering if you are free, whether it would be possible to have a quick look around the flat. I have some memories of the place, mainly looking out the window of what my mother called the sun room to the harbor and the small pier next door. Kind regards, Meg. The comments are mainly similar stories or jokes about the letter writer being there to recover treasure buried in the walls. 771 Springfield. We bought our house in 1995 from the original owner. Wife. Husband had passed. They had the house built for them for their engagement in 1948. They raised 2 children in it, and in 2007, after the mom passed, the daughters, who had grandchildren themselves, contacted me and asked if they could come by for a visit. They came for lunch. They brought pictures of the house as it was being built, and pictures of their parents standing by the fireplace, pics of the yard with them as kids, and outside of the house through the years. It was bittersweet for them and for me. Made me appreciate life and the passing of time. One of the daughters took a picture of her grandson sitting on the front lawn. They left some of the old pictures for me to keep. I framed them, and when the time comes for me to move on, I'm going to leave the pictures along with some of our family for the next owner. Balding Dad 81. Just be sure to keep an eye on her. She may want to get back in to reclaim the treasure chest that's been hidden behind the secret wall panel for the last 70 years. Lol. S. Faselama. My parents ended up going to the house they used to flat in 30+ years ago with their old flatmates. Paid the students $400 to go out on the town and ended up cooking dinner and having a nice evening. Made enough food for the drunk students when they got home. This is in New Zealand, so people are much more relaxed about weird shenanigans. Goblin Green. When I grew up, I used to visit my grandparents in a town about a couple of hours away. They passed away in the 90s. About 20 years later, I was in that town and wanted to visit their old house. I pulled up outside and took a quick pic to send to my sister. I then walked down to the local park I used to play at. When I came back to the car, the owner came out and asked why I was taking pictures of their house. I explained, and they straight away asked, "Are you, insert dad's name?" I said no, but that's my dad. They said I should come in. So I got to go in the house, which was crazy. So many memories. They were redecorating. They stripped the wallpaper. Written on the wall was a poem by my dad, signed and dated in the 50s. Then lots of measurements. My dad, when he was a kid, helped my granddad redecorate, and then had written stuff on the walls for whoever redecorates in the future. That person in the future they were writing to was me. So many variables as to me seeing that text. I told my dad about the story afterwards, and he didn't care at all. Open mouth smile. CMP. I had a guy in his mid-30s show up on my doorstep claiming to have grown up in the house, but moved out when he was 12. He wanted to walk into and see the kitchen and living room. It was against my better judgment, but I made a big deal about putting the dogs away because they are very unpredictable around new people, which isn't true at all. And then I showed him in. His response was unexpected. He became very quiet as he walked through the living room. Clearly he was holding back tears. He thanked me, accepted my offer of a coffee, and we sat in the backyard for an hour as he told me how his life had been perfect when he lived in the house, but he had experienced multiple back-to-back family tragedies that led to him having to relocate to his grandma's house out of state. It was 20+ years later now, and he is starting to see positivity in his future. He needed the closure, and he got it by visiting the house one last time. We've stayed in touch from a distance. He's doing great. We attended his wedding last year to a wonderful person. Now they have a child on the way, and he's in a good stable job. Not everyone is out there trying to rip off others. I'm glad I gave him a chance and trusted him. Updates in comments. We've already been in contact. She sent me several pictures of her and her family in front of our building in the 1950s. So if she's doing a long game, she's doing brilliantly. She's talked about the kids she grew up with next door, where she played, catching the tram, going to the picture theater. She's the real deal. We're quite happy to have her and her husband come and visit. I'm making an attempt to track down the kids she lived next to. At least one is still alive. Update. She and her hubby are visiting on the 17th of March, 2023, in the afternoon. Update of the update. They came and it was brilliant. Read the update here. https www.reddit.com/r/mildly interesting/comments/11gugs0/comment/jcnnxup/ UTM, source equals share and UTM, medium equals web2x and context equals 3. See the photos here. https www.reddit.com/user/mrbeangerox/comments/11udfp1/update. We received a letter from the woman who update the 24th of March. Meg and I were interviewed by a national newspaper, and it's a really good article. https www.domain.com.au/living/something quite special. Why millions of people connected to one woman's emotional journey. Home 1,202,836. Update. We received a letter from the woman who lived in my apartment 70 years ago. And she visited, and it was brilliant. //18.03.23. Photos here. https www.reddit.com/user/mrbeangerox/comments/11udfp1/update. We received a letter from the woman who original post. https www.reddit.com/r/mildly interesting/comments/11gugs0/ We received a letter from the woman who lived in. Meg was clearly moved and very grateful by the opportunity to return to the house she grew up in. And my wife and I was so glad we could provide Meg this opportunity. So Meg and her husband Jed came over at 4 p.m. yesterday. Meg lived in my wife and my apartment in the 1940s and 1950s with her parents here in Double Bay, Sydney. It was a brand new building with 12 apartments when her parents moved in. In the late 1930s. Meg was born in the 1940s, and the family returned to the UK in 1951. We met Meg and her husband Jed at the end of a walkway to the building to start the exploration. Meg remembered walking down the walkway past the new building, though she recalls everything being more open. On entering the huge, according to Meg, apartment building, Meg remembered that her father had tripped on his turn-ups and fell down a couple of stairs at the bottom of the staircase up to the apartment. It took a moment for me to realize that she meant pants cuffs and not some vegetables. At this point, I delivered a joke I'd been working on all week. I turned to Meg and said, "I forgot my keys. Do you have yours?" Quote, When Meg entered our apartment, you could tell immediately that she knew the place. She remembered the curved wall of a cupboard you enter the apartment, though she naturally realized that it was a lot smaller than she remembered. When she turned right into the kitchen, she walked up and said, "There was a curtain here in the middle of the room." The kitchen is a long room with a large window at the end. About 6 meters long, 18 feet, 2.5 meters, 10 feet wide, with a peninsula feature that is two small walls that seem to be randomly placed in the room. It now turns out originally there was a curtain up there, and this separated an incredibly small space for the kitchen with a small dining area. The next room was the bathroom. There was a change. It turns out the toilet used to be in front of the door as you walked in, and is now switched with the hand basin that was located behind the door. She stood there as described the birdcage that sat at the end of the bathtub, next to the sink. You could see the space she created with her hand where the birdcage stood 70 years before. We moved into our spare room. While now it holds some of our most pointless things we've collected over our 17 years here. This was Meg's bedroom. Meg showed where her bed was, under the window. She told me about how she'd look out the window overlooking where the boats were stored. Now, there's another apartment building, which was built in 1959, after Meg had left. The lounge room originally had 4 chairs with a gas fireplace against the outside wall. It turns out the chairs returned to England with the family and are now with Meg in the UK. One question we had: how many PowerPoints were there? The answer: not many. Meg remembered the archway as we enter the lounge and another entering the sunroom. She remembered her family had a large dining in the space. And then there's the view. The apartment looks out over the water. While there's certainly more buildings around the water, only a few things had changed. There was still the wharf next door, the rocks, and a small beach to the east that she would walk upon. She still had a few scars from her more adventurous days. Ultimately, what was similar was the experience of looking out the window at the view. Finally, in our bedroom, Meg showed where her parents' twin beds and wardrobes were. Our bed and wardrobe are situated in the same place. We spent another few hours sitting outside enjoying the afternoon breeze and the view, drinking tea, and catching up with stories from the 1950s. Meg shared about life in the 1950s. The neighborhood was certainly a lot more undeveloped in 1950s. Kids would catch leather jackets, fish from their boats, then row over to Clark Island, about 1,000 meters, 3,000 feet, away to fry them up. It was a different time. We were so pleased that we could do this for Meg and are grateful that Meg reached out and asked to visit. She was blown away by the response. We had 9.8 million people look at the letter, and over 110,000 plus upvote the post. I was really pleased that it started a conversation about revisiting places you lived in the past. Meg was most amused that there a theme in the comments that maybe there was something hidden in the walls. Alas, no. No money. No gold. No Bitcoin. Reminder: I am not the original poster. Sometimes you can go home again. I love the wholesome posts. This is such a sweet story. I visited my childhood home and school when I first moved back to the state. I wish I could have seen the inside of my childhood home, but I visited as a lone 19-year-old, so I wasn't comfortable enough to ask. Walking around my old school was a trip though. It seemed so much bigger as a kid. My boyfriend's dad built a home himself for their family when my boyfriend was a toddler. It was on this big piece of land in the middle of nowhere, with a very small town nearby. They all have very fond memories of the place, and we even have a photo of the house in our living room. After his father died, the family contacted the current residents to ask to look around and spread his ashes nearby. His dad always said living there was the happiest time of his life and he was so proud of that house. The current residents agreed and his family visited. They spread his ashes on the property, with the current residents' permission, and took a photo in front of the house, similar to the one they have that was taken of the family when the kids were small right after his dad finished building it. They also visited the local elementary school where my boyfriend and his sister went to school. Their class portraits were still up on the wall and they got to see one of their old teachers who was still working there. Then they ate at the local diner, still unchanged after all those years, and talked about their dad. My BF said it was one of the most meaningful trips he's ever taken. I forgot my keys. Have you got yours? Fucking top tier comedy. I'm praying I get to use this in my life. Well, that's a great and wholesome post, which is a welcome change given the one about murder. I now own the condo my grandparents lived in when it was built in '72. My grandparents, mom and aunt and uncles had all lived there at various points. When my granddad got too sick and had to be moved to a care home, it was a no-brainer. I bought it. Granddad was over many times before he passed. He liked the renovations we made but thought our laminate floor needed a polish. Lol, I'm glad he was around to see it after we fixed it up. Other relatives drop by when they're in town. They all know the address. Made me nostalgic for the places I've lived with my family as a child and as a father. My husband and I just bought a house a few months ago that needed major renovations. We knew we bought it from a trust, but the neighbors let us know it had been owned by a 94-year-old woman whose husband had also passed years earlier, both of which had lived there since the house was built. They were actually the first house on the street, and were given the opportunity to name the street. They named it after the city they met in. The home was in really bad shape, completely overgrown yard and needed top-to-bottom repairs. Apparently the woman's daughter drove by one day and saw the house was being worked on, so she stopped. My dad and brother were there doing demo work, so they spoke briefly and my dad encouraged her to come back in a few weeks to see the changes we were making. She told them she didn't live in the area but did visit often, so she would try to come back. She stopped by the other day when we were there fitting in the kitchen cabinets. It was so sweet following her around the home she grew up in, with her pointing out which room was hers, telling us about the games her and her brothers would play in the yard, how her dad did mechanic work out of the home, and just hearing stories about her family. We'd actually found old photos of her parents in the attic too, so I was excited to be able to give those to her. She was ecstatic about all the changes we'd made to the house, so genuinely happy that a new family would be moving in and giving the house new life. This house has been somewhat of a nightmare project. Her visit really put a new light on it and has helped change my mindset a bit. My dad built our cottage himself. The worst sunburn I ever got was when I was 12, laying the subfloor and nailing it on the joists. They moved up to retire in it, and eventually sold it because they couldn't keep up a waterfront property. He'd put an addition on it himself. Basically, the whole thing had his fingerprints. When we did the pink insulation, the fibers would get into our skin, so we'd go water skiing each night before dinner, and deliberately took a dive, hitting the water that hard cleaned out the fibers. I have so many memories helping to build it. It was in an area that had suddenly become fashionable for the city folks. It was a well-built building, quite eco-friendly. We had that place until I was 55 years old. The new owners tore it all down. I know that big, fancy homes on waterfront are a thing, have been for a while. But it's gone now. Can't go back. Now this is a perfect Sunday palate cleanser. My family moved into an older home in the mid-80s. We had the previous owners, who sold it in the 60s to the people who sold it to us. They were very polite, commented on the big trees and the colors of the wall. When I went back to the city to bury my mom's ashes, my kids and I stopped by to look. A neighbor saw us and insisted on dragging us to the old house. The new owner had made some serious renovations and it was nice to see. I wish I grew up with the huge walk-in shower. We didn't put my mom's ashes in the old house. In case you're wondering, she went in the wall with my dad's ashes. Thanks for finding such a nice story. Good choice of comments too. It was funny that I was more moved by mementos from the commenter's dad's past than the dad was. A silly life goal of mine is to buy my grandparents' old house. I spent a lot of time there and it is a gorgeous house. Huge windows, galley kitchen, family rooms, and excellently maintained gardens and landscaping. I hate yard work though lol. And as a poor millennial obviously can never afford it. The house my grandmother grew up in was built by my grandfather in 1890. He was the mayor of Edgewood, now named Candler Park, which has since been incorporated into the city of Atlanta. And the house is one of the few originals left in one of the few residential neighborhoods that hasn't fallen prey to urban development, having been bought and lovingly restored several years ago. Our gaggle of girls, her surviving daughter, my great-aunt, her 3 daughters, 2 of their daughters, my mom and aunt. Sadly, my grandmother had passed by then, and my sister and I arranged to go see the house. It was incredibly moving to see the home where my Gigi and her 2 sisters were born and grew up. The most astonishing thing, however, was something in the house itself. My late grandmother was an artist of sorts, and turned making wire sculpture trees mounted on beautiful rocks and minerals into a successful side business during the 70s and 80s. When we walked in, one of her trees was on display in their foyer. We were blown away. They had found the tree at an estate sale and fell in love with it. Strange how the universe works sometimes. My first thought was a King of the Hill episode. Now to read the story. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing. My parents are in the process of selling my childhood home, and while I'm not particularly attached, it still feels like letting go of a piece of myself. Not a single Bitcoin hiding in the walls? I must save this one to read after whatever inevitable gut punch story I read here tomorrow. All the comments about the ulterior motives of retrieving something reminds me of a show I watched. A distant relative inherits a very old mansion, and one of the ghosts that lived tells her where to find a priceless jewel under a floorboard. When they open the jewelry box, there's just a note from the ghost's husband that said, "Sorry, I pawned it." I suspect a lot of hidden treasures are retrieved well before the property is transferred to someone who doesn't know about the treasure. When I was a kid, a woman who had previously owned our house randomly knocked on the door and gave us a bunch of very good paintings she'd done of the place while she lived there. Pretty cool, honestly.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.